Barron Trump walked out of a quiet, upscale cafe in New York City, dressed simply but unmistakably carrying an aura of refinement. The streets were busy as usual, filled with people in a hurry, barely noticing their surroundings. Yellow cabs sped by, business professionals strode purposefully, and tourists snapped pictures of the towering buildings above. It was just another afternoon in the city, a place where wealth and struggle coexisted side by side, yet rarely intersected. On the sidewalk near the cafe entrance, a homeless man sat with his back against the cold concrete. His clothes were worn and frayed, his face lined with exhaustion and hardship. He wasn't aggressively begging. He wasn't even holding a sign. He simply sat there, hands resting on his lap, observing the never-ending stream of people walking past him as if he were invisible. As Barron stepped forward, the man lifted his head slightly and made eye contact. His voice was low but clear as he called out, "Hey, young man, can you spare $1?" It wasn't a desperate plea. It wasn't even a demand. It was just a simple request, a small amount, enough to buy something to eat. He wasn't asking for much, just $1. But even that seemed impossible to get from the hundreds of people who had already passed him by. Most people wouldn't have stopped. Many would have ignored him completely, pretending not to hear, not to see. Some might have tossed him a few coins without even slowing their stride. That was how the city worked. People were too busy, too distracted, or simply too indifferent to acknowledge those who had fallen on hard times. But Barron Trump was different. Instead of walking past like everyone else, he paused, turning to look at the man. His expression was unreadable, not one of pity, not one of discomfort, just quiet contemplation. For a moment there was silence between them, as if the world around them had faded away. The homeless man, surprised that someone had actually stopped, let out a small chuckle. "Didn't mean to hold you up, kid," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just figured I'd ask." Barron didn't reply immediately. He looked down at the man, not in a way that suggested superiority, but with genuine curiosity. The request was simple, $1, but something about the moment made him think. Instead of reaching into his pocket for some loose change, he crouched down slightly, bringing himself closer to eye level. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone calm and steady. The man blinked, surprised. Of all the responses he had expected, this wasn't one of them. People either ignored him or tossed money his way to move on quickly. No one ever asked his name. No one cared. After a pause, he answered, "Mike." Barron nodded. "Nice to meet you, Mike." He glanced around, taking in the surroundings, then looked back at him. "Are you hungry?" Mike hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, been a while since I had a decent meal." Barron stood up, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket. "Come with me." Mike hesitated again. "Kid, I don't want to be a bother." "You're not," Barron interrupted, his tone firm but kind. For a moment, Mike just sat there, staring at him, as if trying to figure out if this was real. Then, slowly, he got to his feet. Barron gestured toward a nearby diner just a few steps away, and they started walking together. People passing by glanced at them, some doing a double-take. It wasn't every day they saw a well-dressed young man walking side by side with someone who looked like he had been living on the streets for years. Whispers started, some recognizing Barron and wondering why he was doing this. When they entered the diner, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm food filled the air. The waitress behind the counter looked up, slightly startled to see the unlikely pair walk in together. Barron didn't hesitate. He led Mike to a booth and handed him the menu. "Order whatever you want," he said simply. Mike hesitated again, glancing between the menu and Barron. "You serious?" Barron nodded. Slowly, Mike placed an order, a simple meal, nothing extravagant. Barron ordered something as well, making sure the man didn't feel like a charity case, but rather just another person sharing a meal. As they waited for the food, Barron asked more about Mike's life. He learned that Mike hadn't always been homeless. He had once worked a steady job, had a family, a home. But life had taken a series of unexpected turns: job loss, medical bills, bad luck. One thing led to another, and before he knew it, he had nowhere to go. Barron listened, not interrupting, not offering false sympathy, just listening. When the food arrived, Mike ate slowly, as if savoring every bite. It wasn't just about the food. It was about being treated like a human being, about someone seeing him, acknowledging him. As they finished the meal, Mike leaned back, exhaling deeply. "Haven't had a meal like that in years," he admitted. "Thank you." Barron simply nodded. He reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out a single dollar, he placed a neatly folded bill on the table. Mike's eyes widened when he saw it. It was far more than just $1. "I hope this helps," Barron said, standing up. Mike looked down at the money, then back up at him, his eyes filled with emotion. He opened his mouth to say something, but for the first time in a long time, he found himself speechless. Barron gave him a small nod before heading for the door. Before stepping out, he turned back and said, "Take care, Mike." And with that, he was gone. The moment stayed with Mike long after Barron had left. He held the bill in his hand, staring at it, not just for its value, but for what it represented: kindness, dignity, hope. As he sat there, still processing what had happened, a realization hit him. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the meal. It was about the fact that for the first time in a long time, someone had truly seen him. Barron Trump stepped out onto the bustling New York sidewalk, adjusting the sleeves of his coat as he prepared to make his way down the street. The winter air carried a crisp chill, and the faint hum of conversations, honking taxis, and hurried footsteps filled the atmosphere. Business people rushed past, their eyes glued to their phones, while tourists admired the towering buildings above. The city, as always, moved at an unstoppable pace. Sitting on the sidewalk, tucked between the entrance of a small cafe and the brick wall of an old bookstore, was a man with weathered hands and tired eyes. His clothes were layered, each one stained and frayed from years of exposure to the elements. His face, covered in the beginnings of a scruffy beard, held lines that told stories of hardship, resilience, and quiet suffering. His posture was relaxed, as if he had long accepted the cold pavement as his resting place. As Barron walked past, the man raised his head slightly and spoke in a voice that carried both humility and weariness. "Hey, young man, can you spare $1?" The request was simple, yet it carried the weight of a life that had seen better days. The man's tone was not desperate, nor was it demanding. It was calm, as if he had asked 100 times before and had long stopped expecting a response. The city had a way of making people invisible, especially those who had fallen on hard times. Barron slowed his stride, his steps halting just a few feet away. His first instinct was to reach into his pocket for a dollar bill and move on, as many before him had done. But something in the man's voice made him pause. It wasn't just a request for money, it was an acknowledgement of existence, a quiet plea to be seen. Turning toward the man, Barron took a moment to truly look at him. The crowd around them continued moving, people weaving past without a second glance. To them, this was just another moment in a city full of distractions. But to Barron, it was something more. He crouched down slightly, bringing himself closer to eye level. "What's your name?" The man blinked, caught off guard. People usually ignored him or tossed coins his way without looking at him. No one had asked his name in a long time. He hesitated before answering, as if trying to remember the last time someone had cared enough to ask. "Mike," he finally said. Barron nodded. "Nice to meet you, Mike." Mike let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Didn't expect someone like you to stop," he admitted. "People usually pretend I'm not here." Barron considered his words, glancing at the never-ending stream of pedestrians moving past them. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice carrying neither pity nor judgment, just curiosity. Mike exhaled, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them up. "Life happened," he said simply. "Used to have a job, a place to live. Then things started falling apart. Lost my job, bills piled up, and one bad break led to another." He shrugged. "Before I knew it, I was out here." Barron listened without interrupting. He had heard about homelessness before, seen it from a distance, but hearing it firsthand made it feel different, more real. "You got family?" he asked. Mike shook his head. "Had a brother. Haven't seen him in years. Guess we lost touch." He paused, staring at the sidewalk. "People think you end up here because you're lazy or made bad choices. But sometimes life just knocks you down harder than you can get back up." Barron considered his words, realizing how easily the world judged without understanding. "You asked for $1, Barron said after a moment. "What would you do with it?" Mike gave a half smile. "Probably get a cup of coffee. Something warm." Barron reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out a dollar bill, he gestured toward a small diner just a few steps away. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you something better than just coffee." Mike hesitated. "Kid, you don't have to—" "I know," Barron interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "But I want to." After a brief pause, Mike nodded, slowly getting to his feet. As they walked toward the diner together, a few people glanced in their direction, some recognizing Barron, others simply curious about the unlikely pair. Inside, the warmth of the restaurant was a stark contrast to the cold outside. The smell of fresh food and coffee filled the air. A waitress behind the counter looked up, slightly surprised to see them walk in together. Barron led Mike to a booth and slid a menu across the table. "Order whatever you want," Barron said simply. Mike hesitated before scanning the menu. He didn't pick the most expensive thing, just something simple. A hot meal, something filling. When their food arrived, he ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were the best meal he'd had in years. As they ate, Barron asked more about his story. He learned that Mike had once been a construction worker, that he used to love baseball, that he still had dreams of getting back on his feet. The more they talked, the more Barron realized that Mike wasn't just a homeless man. He was a person, with a past, with memories, with hope, even if it had been buried under years of hardship. When the meal was finished, Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward Mike. It wasn't just $1. It was far more. Mike's eyes widened. "Kid, this is too much." Barron shook his head. "Use it to help yourself," he said. "Find a warm place to stay tonight. Get what you need." Mike stared at the money, then back at Barron, his eyes filled with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: gratitude. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice almost cracking. "You don't have to say anything," Barron replied. As he stood up, ready to leave, Mike looked at him with newfound respect. "You're a good kid," he said. "World needs more people like you." Barron gave a small nod before heading for the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back one last time. "Take care of yourself, Mike," he said. And then he was gone. Mike sat there for a long moment, staring at the bill in his hands. But more than the money, what stayed with him was the fact that for the first time in years, someone had truly seen him. Someone had treated him like a person, not just a statistic, not just an inconvenience. It wasn't about the dollar. It wasn't about the meal. It was about the kindness that had reminded him he was still human. Barron Trump paused for a moment, looking at the man sitting on the sidewalk. The city around them was moving fast, people rushing to their destinations, cars honking in the distance, the faint sound of street performers playing music somewhere nearby. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was the man who had just asked him for $1, a man whose eyes held a story no one seemed to care about. Instead of simply reaching into his pocket and handing over a bill, Barron did something that caught everyone off guard. He didn't just give and walk away. He didn't ignore the man, like so many others had. Instead, he crouched down so they were at eye level. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone calm but filled with genuine curiosity. The man hesitated, as if he hadn't heard that question in a long time. People usually walked past him without a second glance, throwing coins or murmuring excuses. But here was someone who actually wanted to know who he was. "Mike," the man finally said, his voice raspy from the cold air. "Nice to meet you, Mike," Barron replied, offering a small nod. "How long have you been out here?" Mike exhaled, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "A while," he admitted. "Long enough to see the seasons change more times than I'd like." The response was simple, but there was a weight to it that Barron couldn't ignore. He could tell this wasn't just a man looking for spare change. This was someone who had been through struggles that most people couldn't even imagine. "What happened?" Barron asked, not out of pity, but out of a desire to understand. Mike let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "That's a long story, kid." "I've got time," Barron said. Mike studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Life happened," he said simply. "I had a job, construction. It wasn't fancy, but it paid the bills. Then one day, work slowed down. They started letting people go, and I was one of them. Savings ran out faster than I expected. Lost my apartment. Thought I'd get back on my feet, but one bad break led to another." He paused, glancing at the sidewalk. "Next thing I knew, I was here." Barron listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Most people might have offered a sympathetic nod and moved on, but he wasn't like most people. "You got family?" he asked. Mike shrugged. "Had a brother. Haven't seen him in years. Guess we lost touch." He looked down at his hands. "People think you end up here because you're lazy or made bad choices, but sometimes life just knocks you down harder than you can get back up." Barron considered his words carefully. He had grown up in a world where people had everything they needed. But standing in front of him was a man who had lost everything, and not because he didn't try, but because circumstances had worked against him. "You asked for $1, Barron said after a moment. "What would you do with it?" Mike gave a half smile. "Get a cup of coffee, something warm." Barron reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out a single dollar, he did something unexpected. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the diner across the street. Mike blinked. "What?" "Let's get something better than just coffee," Barron said, his tone firm but kind. Mike hesitated. People had given him money before, but no one had ever invited him to sit down and share a meal. "Kid, you don't have to." "I know," Barron interrupted, "but I want to." For a moment, Mike didn't move. But then, slowly, he stood up. The two of them crossed the street together, and for the first time in a long while, Mike didn't feel invisible. Inside the diner, the warmth was a sharp contrast to the cold outside. The scent of fresh coffee and grilled food filled the air. A waitress behind the counter looked up, slightly surprised to see them walk in together. Barron led Mike to a booth and handed him a menu. "Order whatever you want," he said simply. Mike hesitated before picking something simple. He didn't want to take advantage of the kindness being offered, but at the same time it had been so long since he had sat down for a hot meal. As the food arrived, Barron didn't just sit in silence. He asked more about Mike's life, his favorite memories, the things he missed, the dreams he still held on to. He listened as Mike spoke about the baseball games he used to watch, the places he had traveled for work, the small joys that once filled his life. And as they talked, something changed. The people in the diner, who had barely paid attention when they walked in, started to take notice. A few glanced over, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Here was a young man, someone from a world so different from Mike's, taking the time to sit and talk to him as an equal. When the meal was finished, Barron reached into his pocket again and pulled out a folded bill. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Mike. It wasn't just $1. It was far more than that. Mike's eyes widened. "Kid, this is too much." Barron shook his head. "Use it to help yourself," he said. "Find a warm place to stay tonight. Get what you need." Mike stared at the money, then back at Barron. His eyes, which had been filled with exhaustion, now held something else. Gratitude. Not just for the money, not just for the meal, but for being treated like a person. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice almost cracking. "You don't have to say anything," Barron replied. As he stood up, ready to leave, Mike looked at him with newfound respect. "You're a good kid," he said. "The world needs more people like you." Barron gave a small nod before heading for the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back one last time. "Take care of yourself, Mike." And with that, he was gone. Mike sat there for a long moment, staring at the money in his hands. But more than the money, what stayed with him was the kindness. The simple act of being seen, of being treated with dignity, was something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about the dollar. It wasn't about the food. It was about the fact that, for the first time in a long time, someone had reminded him that he still mattered. Barron Trump stood still for a moment, considering the man's request. A single dollar was all he had asked for, but Barron knew that handing over a bill would do little to change the man's situation. He had seen how people usually responded in moments like this. Some ignored the homeless entirely, while others tossed a few coins without a second glance. But something about this encounter felt different. There was a weight in the man's voice, a quiet desperation that hinted at a story much deeper than what appeared on the surface. Instead of simply giving him the money and moving on, Barron decided to do something unexpected. He reached into his pocket, but rather than pulling out a dollar, he made a different choice. "How about I get you something to eat?" he asked, looking the man in the eyes. The homeless man, who had introduced himself as Mike, hesitated. He wasn't used to people stopping to have a conversation with him, let alone offering more than just spare change. For years, he had become accustomed to being invisible, just another figure on the street that people walked past without a second thought. But now, here was someone treating him like a person, like his needs actually mattered. Mike started, then stopped. He glanced down at his worn-out hands as if unsure of how to respond. "You don't have to do that, kid." "I know," Barron said simply, "but I want to." Mike studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of insincerity. When he found none, he gave a small nod. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, Barron motioned toward a small diner across the street. Mike followed hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure this was real. The warmth of the restaurant was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. As they stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and grilled food filled the air. A few people glanced their way, but no one said anything. Barron led Mike to a booth and handed him a menu. "Order whatever you want," he said. Mike hesitated, his fingers brushing over the laminated pages. It had been a long time since he had the luxury of choosing a meal rather than settling for whatever scraps he could find. He didn't want to take advantage of the young man's kindness, but at the same time, his stomach ached from hunger. After a moment, he settled on something simple, a hot meal that would fill him up. When the waitress arrived, Barron placed the order without hesitation, making sure Mike got more than just the bare minimum. A hot plate of food, a warm drink, and even something extra to take with him for later. As they waited for the meal to arrive, Barron didn't just sit in silence. He asked Mike about his life, not just how he ended up on the streets, but who he was before. Mike was hesitant at first, but as the conversation continued, he began to open up. He talked about his past, about the days when he had a stable job in construction, about the family he had lost touch with, about the moments that had once brought him happiness. He spoke about how one bad break had led to another, how losing his job had spiraled into losing everything. Barron listened intently, never interrupting, never offering empty sympathy. He didn't try to pretend he understood what it was like to be in Mike's shoes, but he made it clear that he cared. When the food arrived, Mike hesitated again, almost as if he couldn't believe it was real. The steam rising from the plate, the rich aroma, it was more than just food. It was a reminder of what he had lost, and for a moment, he didn't know whether to feel grateful or overwhelmed. But as he took the first bite, he closed his eyes and exhaled. "This is the best thing I've had in a long time," he admitted. Barron simply nodded. "Good." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, but then Barron did something even more unexpected. He reached into his pocket again, but this time It wasn't just for a few dollars. He placed a folded bill on the table and slid it toward Mike. It wasn't a small amount. It was enough to help him get through the next few days, to find shelter, to have a chance at something more than just survival. Mike stared at the money, then back at Barron. "Kid, this is too much," he said, shaking his head. "I can't take this from you." "Yes, you can," Barron replied. "And you should." Mike swallowed hard. He had received handouts before, but this wasn't just charity. This was someone choosing to help, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely cared. "I don't know what to say," Mike admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Barron said. For the first time in a long while, Mike felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He wasn't just another forgotten face on the street. Someone had seen him, had acknowledged him, had reminded him that he still mattered. As Barron stood up to leave, Mike looked at him with something close to awe. "You're a good kid," he said. "The world needs more people like you." Barron gave a small nod before heading toward the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back one last time. "Take care of yourself, Mike." And then he was gone. Mike sat there for a long time, staring at the money in his hands. But more than the money, it was the kindness that stayed with him. The simple act of being treated like a person, of being given more than just spare change, was something he would never forget. It wasn't just about the food. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that for the first time in a long time, someone had reminded him that he still had worth. As the moment unfolded, those nearby couldn't help but take notice. People passing by slowed their steps, some exchanging glances, others murmuring among themselves. A few discreetly reached for their phones, capturing the unexpected interaction between Barron Trump and the homeless man. In a world where viral moments could happen in an instant, this was something that felt different, raw, real, and deeply human. Before long, the images and videos made their way to social media. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook exploded with reactions, each platform buzzing with discussions about what had just transpired. The footage showed Barron not only stopping to acknowledge the man's request, but going far beyond a simple handout. His genuine concern, the way he listened, and the way he treated the man with dignity struck a chord with viewers across the country. Headlines emerged almost immediately. Barron Trump's unexpected act of kindness goes viral. Some news outlets framed it as a heartwarming story, highlighting the importance of compassion. Others questioned whether this moment should even be news at all. But regardless of opinions, one thing was certain: the internet couldn't stop talking about it. Comment sections flooded with divided perspectives. Supporters praised the act, calling it a reflection of true character. This is the kind of leadership we need, not just in politics, but in humanity. Say what you will about the Trump family, but this young man just showed more kindness than most people do in a lifetime. Many admired the fact that Barron didn't act for cameras or publicity. He simply saw someone in need and took action. He could have just walked past like everyone else, but he didn't. That says a lot. Others pointed out the contrast between this moment and the general perception of the ultra-wealthy. Discussions flared up about privilege, responsibility, and whether those with immense resources should be doing more to help those in need. It's great that he did this, but imagine if billionaires actually worked to fix homelessness on a systemic level. Nice gesture, but let's not pretend one meal and a few bucks change a homeless person's life. Despite some skepticism, the overwhelming response was positive. Influencers and public figures chimed in, sharing their thoughts. Some even compared Barron's actions to past viral moments involving acts of kindness from well-known figures. A debate soon sparked in political circles as well. Some commentators framed it as an example of good values, while others suggested it was simply a privileged young man doing what should be basic human decency. Late-night talk show hosts picked up on the story, adding humor while acknowledging the deeper implications. Memes and edited clips flooded social media, some adding inspirational quotes over the video footage, while others turned it into lighthearted jokes. A particular meme of Barron sliding the money across the table with the caption, "When you actually care," gained traction, being shared across multiple platforms. Meanwhile, major news networks debated the moment's significance. Morning shows analyzed the footage, inviting panelists to discuss whether this was just a nice moment or if it carried a larger message about kindness and responsibility among the wealthy. Some suggested that the story resonated because people weren't used to seeing figures from high-profile families engage in such down-to-earth interactions. For a brief moment, the conversation moved beyond just Barron himself. It became a broader discussion about empathy, privilege, and the reality of homelessness in America. Advocates for the homeless saw an opportunity to shift attention toward real solutions, while others saw it as an example of how individual kindness could still make a difference. Celebrities and philanthropists began weighing in. Some praised Barron directly, while others used the viral moment to highlight organizations working to support homeless individuals. Donations to shelters and food banks saw a noticeable uptick in the days following the viral event. Despite the online debates, one thing was undeniable. Barron had made an impact, even if he hadn't intended to. He hadn't sought recognition, nor had he performed for an audience. Yet his simple act of kindness had reminded people of something essential, that sometimes it's not about grand gestures or political debates. It's about seeing another human being, recognizing their struggle, and choosing to act with compassion. As the internet continued to buzz, the homeless man at the center of it all, Mike, found himself at the receiving end of unexpected support. Strangers reached out, offering assistance, job opportunities, and a fresh start. While not all stories like his ended with viral fame, for once, someone had seen him, and that had changed everything. A moment of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to transform lives in ways no one can predict. As the homeless man sat there, holding the unexpected gift in his hands, emotions overwhelmed him. He had asked for just $1, a simple request that many ignored daily. Yet what he received was not just money, but dignity, warmth, and a reminder that kindness still existed in a world that often turned away from those in need. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked down at what had just been placed in his hand. It wasn't just about the amount, it was about the gesture, the way Barron had stopped, listened, and treated him like a fellow human being rather than an invisible figure on the streets. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude, hope, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could turn around. For so long, he had been met with indifference. People passed by without a second glance, avoiding eye contact, pretending he wasn't there. The coldness of the world had hardened him, teaching him to expect nothing. But today was different. Someone had acknowledged his presence. Someone had shown that they cared. Around him, the world moved as usual, but something had shifted. Those who had witnessed the interaction whispered among themselves. Some nodded in approval, others seemed deep in thought, perhaps reflecting on the last time they had chosen to help someone in need, or the last time they had chosen to walk away. The effect of kindness was not just on the one receiving it, but on everyone who saw it unfold. As Barron walked away, he didn't look back, nor did he wait for gratitude or recognition. He had done what he felt was right and carried on, leaving behind an impact far greater than he could have imagined. The homeless man sat for a long time, staring at what he had been given before standing up with newfound energy. He had been given a chance and he wasn't going to waste it. With careful steps, he walked toward a nearby diner, one he had often passed but never entered. He pushed open the door, the warmth inside immediately embracing him. A server behind the counter looked up, offering a polite smile. For the first time in months, he had enough to sit down, order a hot meal, and eat without fear of being asked to leave. He took his time, savoring each bite, feeling the warmth spread through him. It wasn't just about satisfying his hunger. It was about feeling human again. As he finished his meal, he glanced at the remaining money in his hand. It was more than enough to last him another few days, but he knew this moment was bigger than just survival. He needed to make a change. The generosity he had received reminded him of something he had long forgotten: hope. Instead of heading back to the streets, he walked toward a small shelter he had heard about before but never visited. Inside, he found a volunteer who greeted him with kindness. They sat down, and for the first time in years, he spoke about his struggles, his past, and his desire to get back on his feet. The volunteer listened patiently and, after a while, connected him with a program designed to help people rebuild their lives. It wasn't an instant solution, but it was a start, and a start was all he needed. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, things began to shift. He found temporary housing, started attending job interviews, and with each passing day, the weight of his past struggles lessened. He hadn't forgotten where he came from, nor the hardships he had faced. But now he saw a future ahead of him, one that had once seemed impossible. The memory of that one moment of a young man stopping to help when no one else would stayed with him. It was a reminder that kindness could come from unexpected places, that no matter how lost one felt, a single act of compassion could create ripples of change. As time went on, his story spread. The viral moment had sparked conversations far beyond the city where it had happened. People from different backgrounds shared their own experiences, reflecting on how small gestures had made a difference in their lives. Some were inspired to help those in need, donating to shelters, volunteering, or simply choosing to acknowledge the humanity in every person they passed. What had started as a simple request for $1 had turned into something far greater. It had become a lesson in humanity, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of a life. And as the homeless man, now no longer homeless, stood on his own 2 feet again, he carried that lesson forward, ready to pass it on to someone else in need.